When 75-year-old Margaret Anderson discovers that her son's wife, Victoria, is slowly poisoning him and stealing his fortune, she finds herself homeless and desperate. But with the help of her son's college sweetheart, she uncovers a sinister conspiracy that hides an even darker family secret. But before we continue with this thrilling story, make sure to hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which city you're joining us from today. The morning sun shone through the large windows of the Anderson mansion, where Margaret Anderson was preparing breakfast like she did every morning. At 75 years old, she still loved taking care of her son David, even though he was now a successful 45-year-old millionaire. As she stirred the pancake batter, she thought about how different their lives had become since David made his fortune in real estate. "Good morning, Mother," Victoria said, walking into the kitchen in her designer silk robe. She was David's wife of 5 years, always perfectly put together with her red manicured nails and blonde hair styled just so. Margaret forced a smile. Something about Victoria had always felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "Good morning, dear. Is David up yet?" "Oh, he had such a terrible headache this morning," Victoria said, pouring herself coffee into an expensive china cup. "I gave him his medicine and told him to rest." These headaches had become more frequent lately, and Margaret worried about her son. He wasn't the same cheerful, warm man anymore. Sometimes he would stare blankly into space during dinner, or forget conversations they'd had just hours before. Robert Matthews, David's best friend since college, and now his business partner, came through the back door without knocking. He did that a lot lately. "Morning, ladies," he said, heading straight for Victoria. They shared a look that made Margaret uncomfortable. "I brought those supplements we talked about," Robert said, handing Victoria a small paper bag. "They should help with David's concentration issues." Margaret watched as Victoria tucked the bag away in her robe pocket. She'd noticed how her daughter-in-law was always giving David pills, powders, and special teas. When Margaret had asked about them once, Victoria had snapped that they were natural remedies and changed the subject. Later that morning, David finally came down, looking pale and confused. He barely acknowledged his mother's presence as he sat at the dining table. "David, honey," Margaret said, putting a plate of pancakes in front of him. "I made your favorite, blueberry pancakes, just like when you were little." David pushed the plate away. "I'm not hungry," he mumbled. Victoria quickly appeared with a glass of orange juice that looked cloudy. "Drink this instead, darling," she said sweetly. "It will help with your headache." Margaret watched as her son drank the juice without question. She remembered a time when David would have been suspicious of anything that looked strange. He had always been sharp and careful. That's how he'd built his fortune. But lately, he seemed to trust Victoria and Robert completely, while growing more distant from everyone else. That evening, Margaret overheard Victoria talking to Robert in the library. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices carried through the slightly open door. "The new mixture is working perfectly," Victoria was saying. "He didn't even question the property transfer papers I had him sign yesterday." "Excellent," Robert replied. "Soon we'll have everything moved into our names. The old lady is becoming a problem, though. She asks too many questions." "Don't worry about her," Victoria said coldly. "I have a plan to get rid of her soon enough." Margaret's heart pounded as she hurried away from the door. Could it be true? Were they poisoning her son? It explained so much. The personality changes, the confusion, the way he seemed to agree with everything Victoria and Robert suggested. The next day was Margaret's 75th birthday. She'd hoped to have a nice family dinner, but Victoria had other plans. Margaret heard her daughter-in-law complaining loudly in the hallway, obviously wanting to be overheard. "I can't stand having that old woman here anymore," Victoria was saying. "She's nothing but a burden and a parasite. Who does she think she is, living in our house like she owns it?" Hurt and angry, Margaret went to find David. She found him in his study, looking out the window with that vacant expression she'd grown to hate. "David, we need to talk," she said. "It's about Victoria. I think she's—" But before she could finish, David turned to her with cold eyes she didn't recognize. "Get out of my house," he said in a flat voice. "You're dead to me, Mum." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. With tears streaming down her face, she packed a small bag and left the mansion that had been her home for the past 5 years. As she walked down the long driveway, she could see Victoria watching from an upstairs window, a satisfied smile on her perfect red lips. Margaret had no idea where to go. How had her perfect life turned into this nightmare? And more importantly, how could she save her son before Victoria and Robert destroyed him completely? Margaret spent her first night on a bench in Central Park. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. The fancy clothes she was wearing didn't keep her warm enough, and every sound made her jump. She had some money in her purse, but not nearly enough for a hotel in New York City. The next morning, she found her way to a homeless shelter. The place was crowded and noisy, nothing like the quiet luxury she'd grown used to, but it was better than the park bench. "First time here?" asked an older woman named Betty, who showed Margaret where to put her things. "Don't worry, honey, we all have a story." Margaret couldn't bring herself to tell Betty that her story involved a millionaire son and a mansion. Who would believe her? Instead, she just nodded and took the thin blanket she was offered. Days turned into weeks. Margaret learned the rhythm of life on the streets, which churches served free meals, which shelters were safest, how to make her few remaining dollars stretch. Her designer clothes got dirty and worn, and she started looking like just another homeless elderly woman. Every day she walked past the Anderson mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of David. Sometimes she saw Victoria's red sports car zoom past, or Robert's black SUV in the driveway. Once, she even saw David being helped into a car, looking more confused and sickly than ever. One rainy evening, when all the shelters were full, Margaret found herself huddled in the doorway of a closed shop. Her arthritis was acting up and she couldn't stop shivering. That's when she heard a familiar voice. "Margaret, Margaret Anderson, is that really you?" Looking up, Margaret saw a face she hadn't seen in 20 years. Emily Wilson, David's college girlfriend. Emily hadn't changed much. She still had those kind eyes and that warm smile that had once made Margaret hope she'd be her daughter-in-law. "Oh my God, what are you doing out here?" Emily asked, kneeling down beside her. She was wearing a social worker's badge from a local community center. Margaret burst into tears, all her pride forgotten. Emily helped her up and took her to a nearby diner, where Margaret finally told someone her whole story. "I knew there was something wrong with that woman," Emily said, her face growing darker as Margaret described Victoria's behavior. "The timing of her appearance in David's life always seemed suspicious to me." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, wrapping her cold hands around a hot cup of coffee. "Well, she showed up right after David's father died, didn't she? And that death never sat right with me. One day Richard was fine, the next day, sudden heart attack. And then this beautiful young woman appears, supposedly a distant cousin of one of David's business associates." Margaret had never thought about it that way before. She remembered how quickly Victoria had moved in on David after Richard's death, how she'd somehow known exactly what to say and do to catch his attention. "And now David's sick all the time?" Emily continued, taking notes on a small pad. "Having headaches, memory problems, personality changes?" Margaret nodded. "Victoria, and Robert are always giving him pills and special drinks. I overheard them talking about some kind of mixture." Emily's expression turned serious. "Margaret, I think I know what's going on. Before I became a social worker, I was a nurse. What you're describing sounds like chronic poisoning. They're probably using something that's hard to detect, but keeps him confused and compliant." "But why?" Margaret asked, though deep down she already knew the answer. "Money," Emily said simply. "With David under their control, they can get him to sign anything. Transfer properties, change his will, empty his bank accounts. Has he signed any papers recently?" Margaret remembered Victoria's words in the library. "He didn't even question the property transfer papers I had him sign yesterday." "We need to stop them," Margaret said, feeling stronger than she had in weeks. "But how? I have no proof, no money, nowhere to go." Emily reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You have me now, and I have friends in law enforcement who might be interested in this case. You can stay at my apartment while we figure this out." For the first time since David had thrown her out, Margaret felt hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could save her son after all. That night, in Emily's cozy one-bedroom apartment, Margaret slept in a real bed for the first time in weeks. But her dreams were troubled by images of David growing sicker, signing away his fortune, while Victoria and Robert watched with greedy smiles. Meanwhile, across town in the Anderson mansion, Victoria was getting worried. She'd seen Margaret watching the house and had told Robert about it. "We need to deal with this problem permanently," Robert said, mixing another dose of their special cocktail for David. "Before she ruins everything." Victoria smiled, a cold, calculating smile that would have chilled Margaret to the bone if she'd seen it. "Don't worry," she said. "I have the perfect plan to get rid of her once and for all." Emily's small apartment became their headquarters for Operation Save David, as they called it. Emily had taken a week off from work, and they spent there days gathering information about Victoria and Robert's past. "Look at this," Emily said one morning, pointing to her laptop screen. She had been digging through old newspaper archives. 3 years before Victoria met David, she was engaged to another wealthy businessman in Chicago. He died mysteriously. They said it was food poisoning. Margaret leaned closer to look at the article. The picture showed a younger Victoria, then, going by the name Victoria Pierce, looking appropriately sad at a funeral. "And let me guess, she inherited everything?" "Actually, no," Emily said. "That's the interesting part. They found out the next day that he had changed his will at the last minute, leaving everything to his sister. Victoria disappeared right after that. They created a timeline on Emily's living room wall using sticky notes and string, just like in the crime shows Margaret sometimes watched. A pattern started to emerge. Victoria had been involved with 3 wealthy men before David. 2 had died under suspicious circumstances, but only after their money had been transferred to new accounts. The 3rd had been saved by a suspicious housemaid who caught Victoria, adding something to his coffee. "But she learned from that mistake," Emily said. "That's why she brought in Robert this time. He has medical training. He knows exactly what drugs to use to make David seem confused, but not obviously poisoned." Margaret had been making her own discoveries. Using Emily's computer, she found records of recent property transfers from David's company. Buildings and investment accounts worth millions had been quietly signed over to Victoria and Robert's names. "We need to get proof of the actual poisoning," Emily said. "Without that, it's just circumstantial evidence." That's when Margaret remembered something. The special tea. Victoria makes it fresh every morning in this fancy blue teapot. She never lets anyone else touch it. "If we could get a sample of that tea," Emily began, but Margaret was already shaking her head. "The mansion has security cameras everywhere now. Victoria had them installed right after I left." But Emily wasn't giving up. She made some calls to old friends from her nursing days, and soon they had an unexpected ally, Maria, one of the maids who still worked at the mansion. She had noticed David's decline and was worried about him. "Maria can't get the tea without being noticed," Emily explained. "But she told me something interesting. Every Thursday morning, Victoria and Robert have a private breakfast meeting in the garden room. They always bring files and papers with them." Thursday morning, Margaret thought hard. That's when the cleaning service comes to do the deep cleaning? There's always different people and Victoria doesn't pay attention to them. Emily's eyes lit up. "I still have some old scrubs from my nursing days with a cleaning service uniform over them." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'll do it. I know that house better than anyone. I know where Victoria keeps her special tea sets, where the security cameras are, everything." "It's too dangerous," Emily protested. "If they catch you, they're killing my son," Margaret said simply. "I have to try." They spent the next 2 days planning. Emily borrowed a cleaning service uniform from a friend. They bought a small camera disguised as a brooch and tiny plastic bags for collecting samples. Margaret practiced moving like a cleaner, keeping her head down, being invisible. On Thursday morning, Margaret's heart was pounding as she walked into the mansion with the real cleaning crew. She kept her face turned away from the security cameras. Using the moves they had practiced, everything had to be perfect. She made it to the kitchen without being noticed. The blue teapot was there on the counter, still warm. With trembling hands, Margaret took samples of the tea and the powder she found in Victoria's special tea caddy. She was just finishing when she heard voices approaching. Victoria and Robert, coming in early. Margaret grabbed her cleaning supplies and turned to leave through the back door, but it was too late. "Well, well," Victoria's cold voice said behind her. "Look who's come back for a visit." Margaret turned slowly, clutching her cleaning supplies. Victoria was standing in the doorway, wearing an elegant white suit that made her look even more dangerous. Robert was right behind her, his hand in his pocket where Margaret knew he kept his phone. "I guess some rats just don't know when to stay away," Victoria continued, her red lips curved in a cruel smile. But what Victoria didn't know was that every word she said was being recorded by Emily, who was sitting in a van outside with her police detective friend, listening through the tiny microphone hidden in Margaret's uniform. The real question was, would help arrive in time? "I'm just doing my job," Margaret said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. She could feel the small bags of evidence in her pocket, hoping they weren't visible through the uniform. Victoria walked closer, her high heels clicking on the marble floor. "Do you really think I'm that stupid? I know it's you, Margaret." She reached out and roughly pulled off Margaret's cleaning cap, letting her grey hair fall free. Did you honestly think you could fool me with this ridiculous disguise? Robert moved to block the door, his large frame casting a shadow across the kitchen. Should I call security? He asked, already reaching for his phone. No, Victoria said, a cruel smile playing on her lips. I think we can handle this ourselves. After all, we're family, aren't we? Just then, David appeared in the doorway, looking pale and confused as usual. What's going on? I heard voices. Margaret's heart broke seeing her son. He had lost weight, and his once sharp eyes were dull and unfocused. He squinted at her as if trying to remember something important. Nothing to worry about, darling, Victoria said sweetly, immediately changing her tone. Just a small problem with the cleaning. Service, why don't you go back to bed? I'll bring your special tea in a moment. But David didn't move. He kept staring at Margaret, and she could see something flickering in his eyes, a hint of recognition, perhaps. The pills from his last dose must have been wearing off. Mom, he said softly, uncertainly. Don't you dare, Victoria hissed, grabbing Margaret's arm hard enough to bruise. He's finally starting to forget you existed. I won't let you ruin everything now. Outside in the surveillance van, Emily was getting frantic. We need to move in now, she told Detective James Parker, her old friend from the police force. They're going to hurt her. Wait, Parker said, listening intently to the audio feed. We need them to say something incriminating. We need proof. Back in the kitchen, Robert had moved closer, standing menacingly over Margaret. I told you we should have dealt with her permanently weeks ago, he said to Victoria. Now she's probably gone through our things, seen the evidence. Evidence of what? David asked, his voice stronger now. The confusion in his eyes was being replaced by something else. Anger. Victoria shot Robert a warning look, but he was too angry to notice. Evidence of how... We've been controlling you, you fool, he snapped. How do you think we got you to sign over half your properties? Why do you think you can't remember anything clearly? That tea you love so much, it's been keeping you confused and compliant. For months. In the van, Detective Parker was already reaching for his radio. That's what we needed. All units move in now. Inside, Victoria realized Robert had said too much. With a snarl of rage, she grabbed the blue teapot from the counter and threw it at Margaret. Hot tea splashed everywhere as Margaret ducked. You've ruined everything, Victoria screamed, her perfect composure finally cracking. Do you know how long we've been planning this? How carefully we set everything up? Ever since you killed David's father, Margaret asked, backing away. Just like you killed those other men. Victoria's eyes went wide. How did you... But before she could finish, David had grabbed her arm. What did you say about my father? His voice was shaking with anger. Robert moved to intervene, but suddenly the kitchen was filled with police officers, their guns drawn. Freeze! Hands where we can see them. Emily rushed in behind them, running straight to Margaret. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? Victoria tried to maintain her composure, even as she was being handcuffed. This is ridiculous. I'm the lady of this house, David. Tell them this is all a mistake. But David wasn't listening to her anymore. He had found the small bags of evidence that had fallen from Margaret's pocket, the tea and powder samples. His hands were shaking as he held them. My head aches, he said slowly, as if waking from a long nightmare. The confusion, the memory. Loss, you've been poisoning me. David, darling, you're confused, Victoria said desperately. You need your medicine. The only thing I need, David said firmly, is to see you both behind bars. As Victoria and Robert were led away by the police, David turned to his mother. The anger in his eyes had been replaced by shame and grief. Mom, he said, his voice breaking. What I said to you, how I treated you. Margaret didn't let him finish. She just wrapped her arms around her son and held him close, tears running down her face. It wasn't your fault, she whispered. None of it was your fault. Emily watched the reunion with tears in her eyes, but she knew this wasn't over yet. Victoria and Robert might be under arrest, but there would be questions to answer, evidence to process, and most importantly, David's health to restore. Detective Parker was already calling for medical support. We'll need blood samples, toxicology reports. Everything they gave him will need to be analyzed. I know some excellent toxicologists, Emily said, and I'll help with his recovery, however I can. As Margaret held her son, she could feel him trembling. The road ahead would be long, but at least now they had a chance. The nightmare was finally ending. Or was it? Because in the police car, as she was being driven away, Victoria's perfect red lips curved into a small, knowing smile. She still had one last card to play, a secret that would shake the Anderson family to its core. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, medical tests, and reporters camped outside the Anderson mansion. David was in and out of the hospital as doctors worked to flush the poisons from his system. Margaret never left his side, and Emily visited every day, bringing food and support. The blood tests confirm everything, Emily explained, looking at David's medical reports. They were using a combination of drugs to keep you confused and suggestible. That's amazing you didn't suffer permanent damage. David sat in his hospital bed, looking better but still shaken. I keep remembering things in pieces, he said. The property transfers, the bank accounts, they took so much. The lawyers are already working on reversing everything, Margaret assured him. Detective Parker says they have more than enough evidence to convict both Victoria and Robert, but their relief was short-lived. The next morning, Detective Parker arrived at the hospital with troubling news. Victoria's demanding a meeting with David, he said. She claims she has information about his father's death, information that could change everything. She's lying, Margaret said quickly. She's just trying to manipulate us again. But David sat up straighter in his bed. I want to hear what she has to say. David, no, Margaret protested. You're still recovering. Mum, David said gently, I need to know the truth about everything. Emily stepped forward. If he's going to meet her, he shouldn't go alone. I'll go. With him? Detective Parker nodded. We can arrange a supervised meeting at the detention center. She'll be behind glass, no chance of any physical contact. 2 days later, David sat in the cold visiting room of the detention center, Emily by his side. Victoria appeared on the other side of the glass, still somehow managing to look elegant, in her prison jumpsuit. Her red lipstick was gone, but her smile was as calculating as ever. I knew you'd come, she said, picking up the phone to talk through the glass. You always were curious about your father's death, weren't you? Just tell me what you know, David said firmly. Victoria leaned forward. What if I told you that Robert wasn't the first partner I had in crime? What if I told you that someone else helped me get close to you? Someone who wanted your father dead? David's hand tightened on the phone. Who? Your father's business. Partner, Victoria said. Charles Winston. Emily gasped. Charles Winston was still running part of the company, one of the few people David had trusted to help manage things while he was sick. That's impossible, David said. Charles was my father's best friend. Was he? Victoria's smile grew wider. Did you never wonder why your father was going to meet Charles the night he died? Why Charles was the one who found his body? How I knew so much about your family's business when we first met? David's face had gone pale. Emily grabbed his free hand, squeezing it supportively. Charles knew your father was about to discover his embezzlement scheme, Victoria continued. He needed a way to silence him, so he hired me. Young, beautiful, trained in the art of poison. It wasn't hard to slip something into your father's drink at their meeting. And then Charles introduced you to David, Emily said, putting the pieces together. Victoria nodded. The plan was simple. I would marry David, slowly poison him just like his father, and Charles would take control of everything. But then I met Robert, and we decided to cut Charles out and take everything for ourselves. Why are you telling us this now? David demanded. Because Charles knows I've been arrested. He knows I might talk. And right now he's destroying every piece of evidence that could link him to your father's death, including the original poison formula that he gave me. Back at the mansion, Margaret was cleaning out Victoria's things when she found a hidden compartment in the back of a drawer. Inside was a small notebook filled with chemical formulas and dates, including the date of Richard Anderson's death. Just then her phone rang. It was Emily speaking quickly. Margaret, get out of the house right now. Charles Winston is on his way there. Margaret looked up to see headlights pulling into the driveway. A car door slammed, and footsteps approached the front door. The notebook felt heavy in her hands as she heard someone putting a key in the lock. Charles Winston had always had a spare key to the mansion. After all, he was practically family. Margaret looked around frantically. She was alone in the house, holding the evidence of a murder, and one of the killers was walking through the door. Margaret's heart was pounding as she heard Charles Winston's footsteps in the hallway. She quickly slipped the notebook into her pocket and looked for a way out. The bedroom had a balcony, but she was on the second floor, too high to jump. Margaret, Charles's voice called out. Are you up here? I thought I saw a light on. He sounded exactly the same as he always had. Friendly, fatherly, completely normal. How had she never noticed anything strange about him before? This was the man who had ordered Richard's murder, who had planned to kill David too. Just a moment, she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. She needed to buy time. Emily had said they were on their way, but how long would it take them to arrive? Charles's footsteps were coming closer. I wanted to check on you after everything that's happened. Terrible business with Victoria and Robert, simply terrible. Margaret could hear in his voice that false concern she'd heard so many times from Victoria. How many lies had she believed over the years? I'm just cleaning out Victoria's things, Margaret said, slowly moving toward the bedroom door. Maybe she could get past him, make it to the stairs. But when she opened the door, Charles was right there. He was smiling, but his eyes were cold. Find anything interesting? No, Margaret said quickly, too quickly. She saw his eyes narrow. You know, Margaret, I've always admired you, Charles said, moving into the room. Such a devoted mother, always watching, always noticing things. That's what makes you so dangerous. Margaret backed away. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. His smile disappeared. Victoria called me from jail, told me everything she revealed to David. And now here you are, going through her things. Looking for evidence, perhaps? At that moment, Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. Charles moved faster than she expected for a man his age, grabbing her arm and pulling out the phone. Emily's message was right there on the screen. Police are 5 minutes away. Keep him talking. Charles's face darkened. Give me the notebook, Margaret. What notebook? His hand tightened painfully on her arm. Don't play games with me. I know. Victoria kept records of everything. It's what I taught her to do. Insurance, she called it. Downstairs, they heard the front door open. Mom, David's voice called out. Are you here? Charles pulled Margaret close, his mouth next to her ear. Not a sound, he whispered, or your son will join his father much sooner than planned. But Margaret hadn't survived the streets and faced down Victoria just to give up now. With all her strength, she stomped on Charles's foot and screamed, David, run! He killed your father. Everything happened at once. Charles shoved Margaret hard, sending her crashing into Victoria's vanity table. The mirror shattered, and she felt glass cutting her hands. David's footsteps pounded up the stairs, while outside, police sirens wailed in the distance. Charles pulled something from his pocket, a small vial like the ones Victoria used to use. I always carry an emergency dose, he said grimly. One way or another, this ends tonight. David burst into the room with Emily right behind him. He took in the scene, his mother bleeding on the floor, Charles holding the vial. It was you, David said, his voice shaking with rage. All these years you acted like you were trying to help me run the company, but you were stealing from us, killing us. Your father was weak, Charles spat. He was going to ruin everything we'd built. And you're just like him, too soft, too trusting. He started to open the vial, but Emily had been watching, waiting for this moment. She grabbed the heavy crystal lamp from the bedside table and swung it at Charles's hand. The vial went flying, shattering against the wall. Charles lunged for David, but years of poison had taken their toll on David's body. He stumbled, and Charles's hands went for his throat. That's when Margaret pulled Victoria's notebook from her pocket and held it over the burning candle on the vanity. Stop right there, Charles, or your insurance burns. Charles froze. Police sirens were getting closer, but his eyes were fixed on the notebook. It's all in here, isn't it? Margaret said. Every formula, every date, every murder you and Victoria planned, even my husband's death. You're bluffing, Charles said, but his hands dropped from David's throat. Margaret let the corner of the notebook start to catch fire. Am I? Charles made a desperate grab for the notebook, but David tackled him from behind. They crashed to the floor just as Detective Parker and his team burst into the room, guns drawn. Charles Winston, Parker said, as his officers handcuffed the struggling man. You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Anderson and conspiracy to commit murder. As Charles was led away, still ranting about betrayal and weakness, David helped his mother up from the floor. Emily was already calling for an ambulance to check Margaret's cuts. The notebook, David said. Can I see it? Margaret handed it to him, her hands shaking. I'm sorry you have to read about your father's murder like this. David looked at the notebook, then at the candle. How did you know holding it over the flame would stop him? For the first time that night, Margaret smiled. I didn't burn it at all, I just held it close enough to make him think I would. Sometimes a mother's instincts are all you need. Emily laughed in relief as she bandaged Margaret's cuts with the first aid kit she'd found, but their laughter faded as they looked around the room, at the shattered mirror, the broken vial, the signs of struggle. It's really over this time, David said quietly. No more secrets, no more lies. But Emily was looking at the notebook with a worried expression. Maybe not, she said. Look at these dates. There are more victims listed here than we knew about. And some of these formulas, they're not just for poison. Margaret and David looked at the pages Emily was pointing to. There, in Victoria's elegant handwriting, was evidence of something even bigger. A conspiracy that went far beyond their family, reaching into the highest levels of society. The sirens had faded away with Charles, but in the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming, and the secrets in that notebook would protect them, or destroy them all. The morning after Charles's arrest, Margaret, David, and Emily sat in the mansion's kitchen, spreading out the pages from Victoria's notebook on the table. Detective Parker had let them keep it temporarily to help identify other victims. Look at these names, Emily said, pointing to a list. Senator William Harrison, Judge Patricia Martinez, CEO Thomas Bedford. They all died in the past 5 years. Heart attacks, strokes, food poisoning. All wealthy, all powerful, David added, his face grim. And all their deaths benefited the same group of people. Margaret was studying another page. These aren't just poison formulas. There are bank account numbers, offshore companies, something called Project Chimera. David suddenly went pale. Project Chimera, I remember something. Back when Victoria was drugging me, I signed some papers about a research facility with that name. She said it was a medical research center. Just then, the mansion's doorbell rang. On the security camera, they saw a delivery man holding a package, but something about him seemed off. His uniform didn't quite fit, and he kept looking around nervously. "Don't answer it," Emily said quickly. She called Detective Parker, who sent officers to investigate. The delivery man ran as soon as he saw the police cars approaching. Inside the package, they found a single red rose and a note that read, "Some secrets should stay buried." "They know we have the notebook," Margaret said. "Victoria and Charles weren't working alone. There's someone else, someone bigger behind all this." David made some calls to his business contacts, trying to trace the connections between the victims in Victoria's notebook. What he discovered was disturbing. All these people were involved in blocking a series of medical patents, he explained. Patents for new drugs, experimental treatments, owned by a company called Phoenix Medical Research. Emily did some quick research on her laptop. Phoenix Medical Research. Wait, look who's on their board of directors. James Morrison. He's the head of the biggest pharmaceutical company in the country. And Charles Winston's college roommate, David added. They've been friends for 40 years. Margaret remembered something. Victoria once had a phone call with someone she called James. She thought I was asleep, but I heard her say something about expanding the testing program. The implications were horrifying. Were Victoria's poisons just the beginning? Was Phoenix Medical Research using the formulas for something even worse? Their investigation was interrupted by another call from Detective Parker. "We have a problem," he said. "Victoria's escaped custody." "What? How?" David demanded. During her transfer to the federal facility, the transport van was attacked. 2 guards dead, Victoria gone. And there's more. Charles Winston was found dead in his cell an hour ago. Apparent heart attack. Emily grabbed the notebook and started flipping through pages frantically. "Here, look at this formula. It causes a heart attack that looks completely natural, no trace in an autopsy. They're cleaning up loose ends," Margaret said. "Charles knew too much, so they eliminated him. And now Victoria's free. We need to get somewhere safe," Emily said. "If they killed Charles in a secure prison cell, nowhere is off limits." But before they could move, all the lights in the mansion went out. In the sudden darkness, they heard the security system power down with a soft beep. "The backup generator should kick in," David said, but it didn't. Through the kitchen window, they saw several dark figures moving across the lawn. Margaret grabbed the notebook and shoved it into her purse. "The panic room," David whispered. "Dad had it installed in the basement. It has its own power supply." They moved quietly through the dark house, using their phones for light. Just as they reached the basement door, they heard the sound of breaking glass upstairs. "They're inside," Emily whispered. The basement stairs seemed endless as they crept down in the darkness. Every creak of the old wooden steps seemed deafening. Above them, footsteps moved through the house, getting closer. Finally, they reached the panic room door. David pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner, but nothing happened. "No power means no scanner," he said, his voice shaking. "There's a manual lock, but I don't remember the combination. Dad changed it just before he died." Margaret stepped forward. "I know it," she said. "Your father told me in case anything ever happened to him. He said I was the only one he could trust completely." As voices approached the basement door, Margaret's trembling fingers turned the lock dial. Right to Richard's birthday, left to David's, right to their wedding anniversary. The heavy door swung open, just as flashlight beams appeared at the top of the basement stairs. They rushed inside and sealed the door behind them. In the panic room's emergency lighting, they watched on the security monitors as armed men in black searched the basement. Leading them was a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, James Morrison himself, and right behind him, wearing her signature red lipstick, was Victoria. The panic room was smaller than Margaret remembered, barely 10 feet square, with metal walls and a bank of security monitors. On the screens, they watched as Victoria and James Morrison's men methodically searched the basement. "They'll never break in here," David said. "The door is solid steel and there's enough food and water for a week." Emily was checking her phone. "No signal. They must be blocking communications." "It doesn't matter." Victoria's voice came through the panic room speaker system. She was looking directly at the nearest security camera, smiling. "We can wait, or you can make this easy and come out now. Your choice." Margaret clutched Victoria's notebook tighter. "What do they want? They must know we've already seen what's in here." "It's not just about the notebook anymore," David said, watching James Morrison examine the panic room door. "Look at him, he's not worried at all. This is about silencing us permanently." Emily was going through the notebook again. "Project Chimera. Here's more information. They weren't just developing poisons. They were using Victoria's formulas to create new drugs. Experimental treatments that looked legitimate, but were designed to create long-term dependency. Like what they did to me," David said quietly. "But bigger," Emily continued. "They were planning to release these drugs through Phoenix Medical Research. Medications that would seem to help at first, but slowly make people sicker, more confused, more reliant on expensive treatments. Millions of people would be affected," Margaret gasped, "and no one would ever know why." On the monitors, James Morrison pulled out a phone and made a call. They couldn't hear what he was saying, but moments later they heard heavy equipment being brought down the basement stairs. "They're setting up something," David said, watching the screens intently. "Some kind of machine." Emily's eyes went wide. "The air vents. The panic room has its own air supply, but if they know the system..." Before she could finish, a faint hissing sound came from the air vents. A thin white mist began seeping into the room. "Gas masks." David ran to a storage cabinet and pulled out 3 masks, part of his father's emergency supplies. They put them on just as the mist grew thicker. "Very clever," Victoria's voice came through the speakers again. "But those masks won't last forever, and we have all night." Margaret was going through her purse frantically. Among her things was her old phone, the one she'd had on the streets, the one Emily had given her with the special recording app. "Emily?" she whispered through her. "The recordings from when Victoria caught me in the kitchen. We were recording everything." Emily's eyes lit up with understanding. She grabbed the old phone and checked it. "The files are still here, and there's something else. When Victoria was arrested, I kept recording. We have her confession about Charles, about Richard's murder, but we can't call out," David said. "They're blocking all signals." Emily smiled. "Not all of them. This phone is special. I got it from Detective Parker. It has a direct emergency line to the police headquarters. They might be blocking regular signals, but this one..." She pressed a few buttons and a small light on the phone began blinking. Through the security monitors, they saw Victoria pacing impatiently, while James Morrison consulted with his technical team about the gas. "How long will the masks last?" Margaret asked. "Maybe an hour," David answered grimly. "After that..." Suddenly Victoria's head snapped up. In the distance they could hear sirens, lots of them. "No!" Victoria screamed, realizing what was happening. "Check them for another phone, they must have..." But it was too late. On the monitors they saw police cars surrounding the mansion. Detective Parker's voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is the police. We have the building surrounded." James Morrison's calm facade finally cracked. He grabbed Victoria roughly. "You said this would be clean, no loose ends." "It's not my fault." Victoria tried to pull away. "How was I supposed to know they had a special phone?" "You assured me the old woman was nothing to worry about," Morrison snarled, "that she was just a foolish mother who would be easy to eliminate. Instead, she's ruined everything." Victoria's eyes darted around like a trapped animal. Then, in one swift motion, she pulled away from Morrison and ran toward the stairs. "Shoot her!" Morrison commanded his men. "She knows too much!" But Victoria was already gone, disappearing into the darkness above. Morrison and his men scattered as police officers began pouring into the basement. Detective Parker himself opened the panic room door, helping them out as a hazmat team moved in to deal with the gas. "We got everything on tape," Emily said, holding up the phone. "Morrison, Victoria, the whole Project Chimera conspiracy." "Victoria got away," David said, watching the police search the house. "Maybe not," Detective Parker replied with a slight smile. "We found this in the notebook." He held up a page with a familiar formula. Apparently, Victoria was so paranoid, she kept taking small doses of her own poisons to build up immunity. But according to this, those doses have a cumulative effect. She won't get far. Margaret looked at the chaos around them. Police officers, hazmat teams, evidence being collected. More sirens wailed in the distance as federal agents arrived to investigate Project Chimera. "It's really over?" she asked softly. David put his arm around her shoulders. "Thanks to you, Mom. You never gave up, never stopped fighting for the truth." But Emily was looking troubled, maybe not completely over. "Look at this." One last page in the notebook. A list of names and people who funded Project Chimera. Politicians, business leaders, foreign investors. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Then we'll keep fighting. Together. No more secrets. No more running." As if in answer, they heard a commotion upstairs. An officer ran down to report. "We found her. Victoria. She collapsed in the garden. Just like you said, Detective." Justice was finally catching up to everyone involved. But as they climbed the basement stairs to face the waiting federal agents and reporters, Margaret couldn't help but wonder, with so many powerful people implicated in Project Chimera, would the truth really be enough to protect them? The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of federal investigations, news reports, and shocking revelations. Victoria was in the hospital, fighting for her life against the poisons she'd taken for years. James Morrison was in custody, along with several other executives from Phoenix Medical Research. Margaret, David, and Emily spent long hours working with FBI agents, going through every detail in Victoria's notebook. The list of conspirators seemed endless: corrupt politicians, pharmaceutical executives, international crime bosses who had funded Project Chimera. The clinical trials were set to begin next month, Agent Sarah Martinez explained during one of their meetings. They had everything in place: fake research data bought off regulators, even a marketing campaign ready to go. Millions of people would have been affected. David was finally starting to look like his old self as the last traces of poison left his system. "I still can't believe how deep this goes. People I've done business with for years, trusted with my company's future. That's exactly why they targeted you," Emily said. She'd been hired as a consultant by the FBI due to her medical knowledge. Your company's distribution network would have helped them spread these drugs across the country. Margaret was looking through a stack of old photographs the FBI had found in Victoria's storage unit. "Look at this," she said suddenly, holding up a faded picture. "It's Victoria with Charles Winston. 20 years ago, Agent Martinez took the photo. This changes the timeline completely. They weren't just random conspirators. They'd been planning this for decades." Just then, Detective Parker burst into the conference room. "Victoria's awake," he announced, "and she's talking, says she wants to make a deal." At the hospital, Victoria looked nothing like her former elegant self. Her face was pale, her signature red lipstick gone. Tubes and monitors surrounded her bed as the poisons continued their work. "I'll tell you everything," she said weakly when they entered her room. "About Richard's murder, about Project Chimera, about the others who are still out there. But I want protection. There are people who will kill me if they know I'm talking." "Why should we trust you?" David demanded. Victoria laughed, then coughed painfully. "Because I'm dying, David dear. These poisons, I thought I was being clever, building up immunity, but they've been killing me slowly all along. I have nothing left to lose." Over the next few hours, Victoria revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. It had started with Charles Winston and James Morrison in college, where they'd discovered Victoria's talent for chemistry. They'd groomed her, trained her, used her to eliminate their rivals and build their fortune. But it wasn't enough for them, Victoria said. They wanted more. Project Chimera was Morrison's idea. Why kill one rich man at a time when you could control millions? The poisons I developed, they found a way to modify them, make them look like legitimate medicines. As Victoria talked, FBI agents were moving across the country, making arrests. Senators, judges, business leaders, people who had seemed untouchable were being led away in handcuffs. But not everyone was caught. Some had been tipped off, disappearing with their millions before they could be arrested. Margaret noticed how Agent Martinez's face tightened every time another target was reported missing. That evening, back at the mansion, Emily was reviewing Victoria's hospital charts. According to these tests, she's telling the truth about dying. The poisons have done too much damage. She has maybe a month left. David was quiet for a moment. I should hate her for what she did to me, to my father, but somehow all I feel is pity. She made her choices, Margaret said firmly, just like Charles did, like all of them did. They chose greed over human lives. Suddenly all their phones buzzed with a news alert. James Morrison had been found dead in his cell, exactly like Charles Winston. It's happening again, Emily said. Someone's cleaning house, eliminating everyone who might talk. Agent Martinez called immediately. We're moving Victoria to a secure facility, and I'm assigning protection details to all of you. Whoever's behind this isn't finished. As federal agents arrived to secure the mansion, Margaret watched the sun setting through the window. They had exposed the truth about Project Chimera, saved countless lives from Victoria and Morrison's plot. But at what cost? David came to stand beside her. What are you thinking, Mom? I'm thinking about your father, she said softly. About how proud he would be of you. Standing up to them, fighting for the truth no matter the cost. He'd be proud of you too, David said, hugging her. You never gave up, never stopped believing in me. Emily joined them, holding a stack of new files from the FBI. We've identified more shell companies, more connections. This isn't over yet. No, Margaret agreed, watching more federal agents arrive outside. But whatever comes, next we'll face it together. No more secrets, no more lies. In her hospital room across town, Victoria was being prepared for transfer. But as the nurses helped her into a wheelchair, a small smile played across her pale lips. She might be dying, but she still had one last secret, one that would shake the Anderson family to its very foundation. The secure facility where Victoria was being held looked more like a fortress than a hospital. Armed guards patrolled the corridors, and security cameras watched every angle. But none of that mattered when Victoria finally dropped her last bombshell. I need to see Margaret Anderson, she told Agent Martinez, alone. Margaret arrived on a cold morning, Emily and David waiting anxiously in the hallway outside. Victoria was propped up in bed, looking even weaker than before. You won't have to wait long for your revenge, Margaret said, looking at Victoria's monitors. The doctors say you don't have much time left. That's why I called you, Victoria said. Her voice was barely a whisper now. There's something you need to know about Richard's death. Something I never told anyone, not even Charles or Morrison. Margaret sat down slowly. What more could there possibly be? The night Richard died, Victoria paused, catching her breath. He called me. He'd discovered everything. The poisons, the plans for Project Chimera, all of it. But he didn't call the police. He called me because he recognized me. Recognized you? From where? Victoria's lips curved in a bitter smile. From an old photograph. One he'd seen in his wife's things. You see, 25 years ago, before I changed my name, I was Sarah Collins, and I had a baby girl who was taken from me and given up for adoption. Margaret's heart stopped. No. Yes, Victoria said. Richard recognized me because I was his wife's daughter. Your daughter. I'm the baby you gave up when you were 16. The room spun around Margaret. That's impossible. My baby, they told me she died. They lied. I spent years tracking down my birth parents. When I finally found out who you were, I was so angry. You had this perfect life, this loving family, everything I never had. So I decided to take it all away. Margaret staggered to her feet. You're lying. This is just another one of your games. Check my DNA, Victoria said. Agent Martinez already has. That's why I'm telling you now. You'll find out anyway. She pulled an old crumpled photograph from under her pillow. This was taken the day I was born, before you gave me away. Margaret's hands shook as she took the photo. There she was, so young, holding a tiny baby. She remembered that moment like it was yesterday, the last time she'd held her daughter before they took her away. All these years, Victoria continued, I poisoned your family, destroyed your life, trying to punish you. But in the end, I only poisoned myself. She started coughing violently. Alarms went off and medical staff rushed in. Margaret backed out of the room in a daze. In the hallway, David caught her as her knees gave way. Mom, what happened? What did she say? But it was Emily who understood first, seeing the shock on Margaret's face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "She's your daughter, isn't she?" Over the next few days, DNA tests confirmed everything. Victoria, Sarah, really was Margaret's long-lost daughter. The baby she'd been told had died. The child she'd mourned for decades had grown up to become the woman who destroyed their family. David struggled to process the news that the woman who'd poisoned him, who'd helped kill his father, was actually his half-sister. "It doesn't change anything," he said firmly. "What she did, she made her choices." A week later, they received the call. Victoria had slipped into a coma, the poisons finally winning their long battle. Margaret stood at her bedside, holding the hand of the daughter she'd never known, watching her take her last breaths. "I forgive you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if Victoria could hear. "And I'm sorry I couldn't protect you all those years ago." After Victoria's death, the full story of Project Chimera came out. The remaining conspirators were arrested, their networks dismantled. The modified poisons were destroyed before they could harm anyone else. 1 month later, Margaret stood in the mansion's garden, planting new roses where Victoria's poisoned ones had once grown. Emily and David were there, helping her rebuild not just the garden but their lives. "I've been thinking," David said, watching his mother tenderly pat soil around a new plant. "Maybe we could use some of the company's resources to help other families. People separated by adoption, children who need support." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Your father would have loved that idea." Emily took David's hand. Their relationship had grown stronger through everything, love blooming despite, or perhaps because of, all they'd faced together. "The foundation can help make sure no other child grows up feeling as lost and angry as Victoria did," Emily said. "Something good can come from all this pain." As the sun set over the garden, Margaret looked at the new life growing from the earth. Secrets had nearly destroyed her family, but the truth, painful as it was, had finally set them free. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her face to the warm evening light, "and to family, not just the one we're born with, but the one we choose to build." David and Emily echoed her words, and together they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The mansion that had once been filled with poison and lies was now a home again, filled with love, truth, and hope for the future. In the end, it wasn't money or power that had saved them. It was love, the love of a mother who never gave up, the love between a man and woman who found each other again, and the healing power of forgiveness. Margaret's final secret was out, but unlike the poisonous secrets that had come before, this one had led not to destruction, but to understanding. And in that understanding, they had all found something they thought they'd lost forever: peace, the end.